Thank you so much, and thank you to the team at Google Talks, Keith and Jeremy and Susanna. It's a real honor to be here. It's really a fun campus. And it's true, today I'm going to be talking to you about Diderot. And I think the first question, and Keith's kind of alluding to that, is who is this guy? Who is Diderot? And why is this 18th century Frenchman of interest to us today? I'm going to start with a really fast historical synopsis, then we're going to get back into his life a little bit more deeply in a second. So he's born in a small city near Dijon in Burgundy. He goes to, which is a very small city, we'll talk about in a second. He goes to Paris at age 14 to study to become a priest, which is quite ironic because he ends up being the most notorious atheist of the 18th century. While in Paris, he drops out of the Sorbonne, which is the faculty of theology at the time, and he spends 10 years of doing not too much. He has a great dilettante phase, which I always recommend to all of my students. During this time, he does do a couple good things. He teaches himself English, teaches himself Italian, and he marries a barely literate laundress. He then becomes a translator of English, and then an author of anonymous, scandalous books. First, there's a novel, and then there is a work of philosophy that's quite heretical. We'll talk about that in a second as well. 1749, he's thrown into prison for 3 months. He's released, and at that point, he starts to work much more earnestly on the Encyclopedia, this gigantic encyclopedia. And after he is released from prison, you have to remember this is a time in France when Paris is pretty much like Soviet Moscow and Tehran combined. He is unable to publish. He's followed by spies at all times. It's very difficult for him to hang out in a cafe, for example, and talk freely. And so he's going to hide his works for the second half of his career. He dies in 1784, 5 years before the French Revolution. Now, if you've heard about Diderot, as Keith is saying, you probably know him as the driving force behind the world's first comprehensive encyclopedia, which is published between 1751 and 1772. And this is a massive undertaking. 17 volumes of text, 11 volumes of plates, 3,000 individually printed and compiled illustrations, 74,000 articles, and inside here are 23,000 cross-references. He really is one of the first hyperlinkers of all time, Diderot. And he thinks this way. He thinks as a hyperlinker. The book itself here, again, published over the course of 2 decades, weighs 150 pounds. It's enormous. Each volume is about this big. Now, he wrote 7,000 articles for this book, which is pretty amazing, on articles ranging from political authority, the political authority of the king, also geographical articles on West Africa. He wrote on everything. Jimmy Swales, one of the founders of Wikipedia, told me he really is the patron saint of Wikipedia. And he should be also the patron saint of Google, too, in many ways. Why? Because he is perhaps the first person to fully deploy the democratic power of knowledge on a massive scale. He's also among the first people to conceive of philosophy as something of a cudgel, as a tool which he could use to challenge received ideas and long-standing traditions, be they political, social, moral, or even sexual. His encyclopedia was not only about being a repository of knowledge, it was designed to change the way his entire era thought, and it worked. Now, consider how the encyclopedia defined philosophy, and he was being far more frank than Wikipedia's mission statement. Philosophy, he writes, should trample underfoot prejudice, tradition, antiquity, shared covenants, authority. In a word, everything that controls the mind of the common herd. Now, what I love about Diderot is that, at least in the US, his mind and his writings, even now, would still be considered very dangerous, and certainly way too dangerous to teach in high school. And even in France, he remains the bad boy of the French Enlightenment. Now, to begin with, he's a skeptic. He's an unbeliever. He's an atheist. He's a philosopher who believes that there's one level of being, no spiritual causality. He believes that we should explain the world with natural causes and derive our morality from these natural causes as well. And all of this is part of his overall mission, inviting us to question our received ideas. And he has two mottos, which are also my mottos. Skepticism is the first step toward truth. And what has never been called into question has never been proven. Now, in many ways, you could describe Diderot as a radical empiricist, someone who interrogated everything he knew and everything he had been told as a child. Now, at the same time, Diderot is far more joyful than many unbelievers. He believed that life itself was miraculous, and he believed in the wonderful product of chance and that we should savor every minute of our lives. He described us humans and our existences as a series of contingencies, and he said that we as individuals are walking on both sides of eternity, or within two sides of eternity. And he said the same thing about our species. He thought that we as a species were going to disappear eventually. Now, another reason why I think Diderot is such a great lifelong companion when you start to read him over and over again, you can see his writing, you can see his mind functioning within his writing. It's vibrant, it's fresh, it's dynamic, it's not old at all. It seems so modern. And this is the way his mind functioned. He was so fertile, so dynamic that his friends claimed that he didn't have ideas. They claimed that ideas had him. And the most telling anecdote regarding Diderot's intellectual exuberance comes from Catherine the Great empress of all the Russias, who invited Diderot to her court for 3 months in 1773. She wrote that after several visits from Diderot, she ordered that a table be put between them because Diderot would often go into these fevered monologues and start banging his hand on her leg, slapping her knees, grabbing her thighs to make a point. And she said she was getting black and blues. This is part of his personality. He's a talker. He's enthusiastic. He's warm and he's wonderful. And you really see this in his books because many of his books feature him in dialogue with himself and others. Diderot fell desperately in love with every subject he studied, be it mathematics, science, medicine, philosophy, politics, classical antiquity, drama, literature, musicology, or the fine arts. His friends called him le philosophe, which means the philosopher, because his passion for learning made him seem like an ancient truth seeker, a simple and honest soul who was born without ambition. But he also believed in the emancipatory power of philosophy and thought. Now, despite all this, in the United States, Diderot is the lesser known of the three major French Enlightenment figures, and contrasting him with the other two, I think is quite helpful. The first of these, this kind of group of three men is Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He's probably the best known of the three in the United States. He used to be Diderot's best friend. They become mortal enemies by the end of their life. He's one of the few thinkers, a few writers, who is taught in political science departments. He's also taught in philosophy departments, and he's also taught in literature departments. So he gets a lot of play in the United States. He was the most successful novelist of the 18th century, but we don't read his novels anymore, really. But we do know him as an incredibly prescient political thinker. He wrote The Social Contract. He was a voice for the downtrodden. He's an inspiration for Robespierre, the French revolutionary, for Karl Marx, and for today's social justice warriors, Bernie Sanders, AOC, whether they know it or not. He was also the philosopher who introduced an anti-progress view of civilization, which is, of course, very different from the way Diderot thought. He claimed that the more we civilize ourselves, the more we dehumanize ourselves. The other 18th century great is, of course, Voltaire. Voltaire, we know probably from high school, is the author of Candide and some other kind of philosophical stories. And like Rousseau and like Diderot, he was a great polymath. He thought about everything. He was a polygraph. He wrote in all sorts of different genres as well. He's a historian. He's by far the era's most famous playwright. He's the most famous internationally known public intellectual. He's a fierce champion of human rights and particularly freedom from religion. And all three of these men contributed to what we now call the Enlightenment era's thought. But there's one big difference between Rousseau and Voltaire on the one hand and Diderot on the other. Voltaire and Rousseau both believed in God, although they had no use for scripture. They were what the 18th century called deists. And Diderot thought you could only think your greatest and most outrageous thoughts if you thought beyond God, after God. And his thought and his writing proves this. He went way beyond what Rousseau or Voltaire were writing about during his era. Now, Diderot as a subject is a pretty tough guy to write about. Personally speaking, the biggest challenge from my point of view is that it's very difficult to write about a genius when you're not one. The second thing is his life doesn't lend itself to a tidy chronology. Diderot is the kind of guy who would wake up in the morning and write about Chinese poetry. And then he would tackle the question of sugarcane, slavery, plantations before lunch. After lunch, he would write a play, and then he would go to the Louvre and write a review of the year's art salon. And then after dinner, he'd work on a novel about sexual abuse in convents and then dash off a 20-page letter to his mistress. He did a million things a day, and it's literally impossible, and it would be terribly boring to try to reconstruct it in that way. Ultimately, if you decide to pick up my book and read it, you'll see that I figured the best way to divide up his life is just smack dab in the middle. In the first half, I introduce him from his humble origins as a wannabe priest coming from the small city of Langres. I follow him to Paris, where he drops out of the Sorbonne, as I said, and then finally to Vincennes prison. This is really a dramatic pause in his life. He was 35 at this point, and he lived another 35 years after this. He was thrown into jail for writing a smutty novel, which is essentially a precursor to the Vagina Monologues, which featured talking sex organs. He also wrote another book, as I said, that refutes the existence of God, called The Letter on the Blind. Now, in the second half of the book, after we get out of Vincennes, at this point, Diderot is being harassed and pursued and surveilled at all the times. I move into a more thematic mode. And at this point, he is writing for posterity because he cannot publish. So he's a man who is suffering from censorship in the second half of his life. Nonetheless, I resurrect what's going on here and talk about his life as a sexologist, a man who naturalizes homosexuality, something that nobody did in the 18th century. I read about Diderot, the natural historian, the thinker who presented a godless chronicle of the world and the human species, anticipating natural selection 90 years before Darwin. We talk about Diderot, the art critic, the person who invites us all to break free of our conventions and make the viewing of art as personal and as inspired as possible. There's also a chapter on Diderot, the political thinker, the advisor to Catherine the Great. And in 1776, he actually writes to the so-called American insurgents, these revolutionaries in the fledgling United States who are putting together this experiment in democracy. There's a chapter on Diderot the skeptic, the critic of religion, and Diderot the political prisoner, which is very an intriguing part of his life. Now, I want to read from the book a little bit to give more of a taste of who he is. But before I do so, I want to talk a little bit about my favorite part of writing this book, because getting to know life is something that is really very intense, very intimate. Some moments are difficult, some moments are fun. And the part I had the most fun doing was working with the people of the small town of Langres. Now, Langres is a really neat town. As I said, it's not too far from Dijon in Burgundy. It's home of a really great cheese called Langres, Langres, which you can find occasionally at Whole Foods. Quite stinky, but delicious. There were 8,000 people living in Langres in the 18th century. There are now 8,000 people living there now. It's 1 square mile, essentially the size of the kind of the small old part of old Venice. It's surrounded by ramparts, as you can see, some of them dating from the Roman Empire. And nothing has really changed there. It looks like a Game of Thrones set. I actually took the liberty of stealing one image from Google. I hope you won't be too mad about this, but this comes from Google Maps down here at the bottom. And there you have an early 19th century watercolor from up top. The only thing that's changed is there's one Renaissance building which has disappeared here. Really, it has not changed too much. Now, Diderot here was born into a family of tradespeople, and this is quite significant because later on he's going to look at the trades as being intrinsically superior to aristocratic values. He's much more of a democrat than he is an aristocrat. His father was a master knife maker, a cutler. Here is his father here. Diderot has got the same bulbous forehead that Diderot did. His mother came from a family of tanners, which is to say people who dealt with animal skins and the odoriferous and smelly trade of making leather, which is a really awful thing. Diderot grew up in a house which was a house of industry and labor. This is a cutlery shop where his father would make cutlery, surgical instruments. You can imagine he grew up in a place where he would hear the hammer, the tapping of the hammer all the time, the pumping and smell of the bellows, and then the grinding of the stone. And you can see here a man down at the bottom here who has actually got his nose next to the grindstone, from which we get the expression. Now, Diderot only spent 14 years or so in Langres, but his legacy looms large. In Paris, there's so many writers and ghosts of writers who are elbowing each other for room. You really can't get a sense of people sometimes here. But in Langres, his spirit kind of infuses the town. First of all, there is the big statue in the square here. There used to be a statue of a cross, a big marble cross here in the 18th century, and now Diderot has replaced this symbolically the victory of positivism over so-called superstition. The kind of wiseacre politicians who put this statue here were very careful to. They were very careful to position his back toward the cathedral as something of an affront. Hanging out in a city like this was a riot. I've spent a lot of time there. The place is full of commerce and businesses which are named in his honor. There's here the Diderot Boulangerie bread shop, the Diderot driving school, the Diderot cigar shop. Remember, this place is really tiny. The Diderot stationery store, and the Diderot Junior High, and my favorite, the Diderot Senior High. They're both there. There's also a fantastic Diderot museum. I stayed at the Hotel Cheval Blanc, where there's the great Diderot restaurant. And people have been so nice to me during this whole time. They're just so welcoming and grateful to have an American biographer write about their hero. I've been there, just a tiny anecdote. The last time I was there, somebody gave me a knife, which is a replica of a knife that was made by Diderot's father. And I had a little tiny bag, and somebody gave me a marble bust of Diderot to carry home with me to the United States. So much of Diderot, and you'll find this out in a second when I read, is about legacy. He was very interested in talking to us. And so the people of Langres are very delighted that I'm trying to carry this legacy on here in the United States. So at this point, I want to read a little bit from the book, a little short segment from the prologue, which will give you more of a sense, I think, of this guy. And this is called Unburying Diderot. Sometime during the snowy winter of 1793, under cover of night, a small group of thieves pried open a wooden door leading into the church of Saint-Roch. Forced entry into the Paris sanctuary was nearly a weekly occurrence during this time of revolution. In the early 1790s, anti-clerical vandals had pulled enormous religious paintings off the walls and slashed the canvases. Other trespassers had made off with more portable works of art, including an exquisite statue sculpted by Étienne Maurice Falconet. On this particular night, however, the intruders came to steal whatever copper, silver, or lead they could find in the crypt located under the Chapel of the Virgin. Setting to work in the front of the chapel's altar, the grave robbers used long iron bars to lever aside the mattress-sized marble slab in the center of the floor. Though they surely had no idea who was buried in the vault, the most loutish of the group, assuming he could read, would still have recognized the name of the writer Denis Diderot, inscribed on one of the caskets. Dead for 9 years, the notorious atheist had been the driving force behind the most controversial book of the 18th century, the Encyclopedia. This massive dictionary had not only dragged sacrilege and free-thinking out into the open, but triggered a decades-long scandal that involved the Sorbonne, the Paris Parliament, the Jesuits, the Jansenists, the King, and the Pope. None of this old history mattered to the burglars. After removing Diderot's lead coffin from the vault, the men simply shook his decomposing body onto the church's marble floor. The following day, Diderot's remains, along with the other desecrated cadavers from the crypt, were presumably gathered up and transferred without ceremony to a mass grave about a mile to the east. Nobody noticed, nobody reported it in the press. Assuming the church's few remaining Paris priests had realized that Diderot had been buried in the church, they were undoubtedly relieved to be rid of the scandalous unbeliever. Some 20 years before his remains were carted out of Saint-Roch, Diderot had prophetically remarked that whether you rot beneath marble or under the ground, you still rot. Yet being discarded and forgotten among a mound of recently guillotined aristocratic corpses would not have been his preference. Atheist or not, Diderot had long expressed a keen interest in being remembered and, if all things worked out, celebrated by future generations. Posterity is to the philosophe, he once stated, as heaven is to the man of religion. Diderot's interest in speaking to future generations from beyond the grave had come out of necessity. In 1749, shortly after the then 34-year-old writer had published a work of intemperate atheism entitled The Letter on the Blind, 2 gendarmes showed up at his house, arrested him, and dragged him off to Vincennes prison. 3 months later, shortly before he was released, the Lieutenant General de Police made a special trip to the prison to warn the writer that any further immoral or irreligious publications would bring a jail sentence measured in decades, not months. He took this threat seriously. For the next 33 years, he avoided publishing the kind of inflammatory books that he had authored as a young man. Much of the energy that he might have devoted to such endeavors was redirected toward the all-consuming encyclopedia. When he finally completed the last volume of illustrations in 1772, the now elderly writer was well aware that he was a celebrity throughout Europe and even in parts of North America, but he was not really considered a literary great. His fate, as he admitted quite openly, was perhaps to survive long after his reputation as an encyclopedist had faded, growing ever older and vanishing without leaving a significant work behind. This, in fact, seemed to be the case when he died in 1784. Although several obituaries credited him for being the leader of the generation of thinkers that had utterly changed the country, they also hinted that he had not lived up to his indisputable genius. Even his friends reluctantly agreed. Jacques-Henri Meister, who revered the man, wistfully acknowledged that Diderot never produced a book that would have placed him among the first tier of our philosophers or our poets. Charitable friends blamed the writer's supposedly limited literary production on the burden of the encyclopedia. Others privately ascribed this failing to his famously whirligig brain. As was often the case, the sharp-tongued Voltaire, who both admired and distrusted Diderot, came up with the cleverest remark on the subject. He apparently joked that the encyclopedist's mind was an oven that burned everything that it cooks. What Voltaire and virtually everybody else did not know was that Diderot had actually written an astonishing range of improbably modern books and essays for the drawer as the French like to say. Holed up in his 6th-floor garret office on the Rue Taranne for the last third of his life, Diderot produced this cache of writing with the hope that it might one day explode like a bomb. This moment was prepared for carefully. When the author reached his 60s, which was borrowed time during the 18th century, he hired copyists to produce 3 separate collections of manuscripts. The first and most complete set was entrusted to his daughter, Angélique. A second, less complete group of writings was transferred to his designated literary heir and devotee, Jacques-André Naigeon. And 6 months after his death, 32 bound volumes of manuscripts, along with Diderot's entire library of 3,000 books, traveled by ship to Catherine the Great in St. Petersburg. Diderot's unpublished books, essays, and criticism far surpassed what he had published during his lifetime. Among these writings were 2 very dissimilar but equally brilliant novels. The first of these, The Nun, is a gripping pseudo-memoir of a nun who suffers unspeakably cruel abuse after she announces that she wants to leave her convent. The second, Jack the Fatalist, is an open-ended anti-novel where Diderot used fiction to take up the problem of free will. But there were also thick notebooks of revolutionary art criticism, a godless science fiction-like chronicle of the human race, a secret political treatise written for Catherine the Great, a humorous satire on the absurdity of Christian sexual mores set in Tahiti, as well as some of the most moving love letters in the history of French literature. To become familiar with Diderot's work is to be stupefied. Among other things, the philosophe dreamt of natural selection before Darwin, the Oedipus complex before Freud, and genetic manipulation 200 years before Dolly the sheep was engineered. These hidden works did not appear in the months after Diderot died. They trickled out over the course of decades. Several of his lost books were published during the waning years of the French Revolution. Others appeared during the course of the Bourbon Restoration, 1814 to 1830, while still more of his writings emerged during the Second Empire, 1852 to 1870. Perhaps the most significant addition to Diderot's corpus came in 1890 when a librarian discovered a complete manuscript version of Diderot's masterpiece, Rameau's Nephew, in a bouquinist's stand on the banks of the Seine. In this riotous, philosophical dialogue, the writer courageously gave life to an unforgettable anti-hero who extolled the virtues of evil and social parasitism while preaching the right to unbridled pleasure. To say that the arrival of these lost books had an effect on subsequent generations would be putting it mildly. Diderot's effusive art criticism inspired Stendhal, Balzac, and Baudelaire. Émile Zola credited Diderot's vivisections of society as the foundation of the naturalism that characterized his and Balzac's novels. Social theorists, too, were spellbound by Diderot's prescient thought. Karl Marx, who borrowed deeply from Diderot's musings on class struggle, listed the writer as his favorite author. And Sigmund Freud credited the Ancien Régime thinker for recognizing the unconscious psychosexual desires of childhood in Rameau's Nephew long before he and his fellow psychoanalysts had done so. If many critics continued to disdain the writer as too atheistic, too paradoxical, and too unrestrained, he was nonetheless becoming the preferred writer of the 19th century avant-garde. The full extent of Diderot's influence was not known, however, until a young German academic, Herbert Dickmann, located the final lost cache of Diderot's writings. Having heard rumors that Diderot's conservative descendants continued to possess some of the lost manuscripts originally given to the writer's daughter, the Harvard professor finally obtained permission to visit the family chateau in Normandy in 1948. After overcoming the post-war suspicions of the caretaker, who was put off by the German accented French of the professor, Dickmann was ultimately directed to some armoires on the chateau's second floor. Entering a room that contained several large freestanding closets. He sidled over to the first one and peeled back the door panel, hoping perhaps to find a lost work or two. He was confronted with an enormous stockpile of Diderot's bound manuscripts. So stunned was the professor that he simply dropped to the floor. Diderot's final cache, the lost collection of manuscripts that he had given to his daughter, had at last been found. These archives have become the most important source for what we know about Diderot and his works. Most astonishing, perhaps, was the discovery of several manuscripts annotated in his hand that revealed that he had been the primary ghostwriter for the Philosophical and Political History of the Two Indies, which was the best-selling critical examination of European colonization. It had been Diderot, as it turned out, who had penned the most influential and best-known anti-colonial sections of this multi-volume book, including an imagined exchange between an enslaved African who not only claimed the right to be free, but who predicted a day when Caribbean slaves would justifiably put their masters to the sword. Composed in 1779, a decade before the events in Saint-Domingue, Haiti, would prove him right, this is perhaps the most telling example of the writer's radical politics, not to mention his ability to see into the future. Some 300 years after he was born, Diderot has now become the most relevant of Enlightenment philosophers. That he refrained from publishing or taking credit for his most forward-looking ideas during his lifetime was not simply a matter of avoiding persecution. He intentionally chose to forego a conversation with his contemporaries in order to have a more fruitful dialogue with later generations. Us, in short. His heartfelt hope was that we, the sympathetic and enlightened interlocutors of the future, might finally be capable of sitting in judgment of his hidden writings, writings that not only question the moral, aesthetic, political, and philosophical conventions of the Ancien Régime, but our own era as well. Thank you. And I'd be delighted to take some questions.
Yeah, so anyone question?
So many, I have to figure out where to start. His thoughts on free will. One reason for people rebelling against the church is the idea of predestination, and people finding that difficult to deal with. On the other hand, you have a very scientific mode of thought, going back to Greek skeptics and Buddhists of the world just is what it is, it's laid out, there's no God or anything, but we are just mapping out this path in space and time that is already there and existing. As you say, Jacques Le Fatalist touches on these issues, but it wasn't clear to me, at least when I read it, that it was taking a particular point of view. It was more just sort of playing with the ideas. Did he write about ideas of free will more directly and address these things?
Yeah, the question of free will in Diderot is fascinating. Are we really free in a material world? That's his question. So certainly there are examples in religion of predestination, the Calvinists and the Jansenists, for example. Diderot looks at predestination in a different kind of sense, a materialist sense. If all the world is ruled by physical laws, how can we possibly escape our physical destiny? That's the kind of problem he was grappling with. And in some of his kind of scientific writings, he thinks about this a little bit, but as you said, in this novel, he actually does this in a very playful way. First, as a narrator, the narrator is completely crazy. He says, how does this novel start? I don't know, I'll start it this way. And so you can see the kind of a demonstration of free will by the novelist himself, by the narrator, which is fascinating. And yet, the characters are kind of these Spinozist, super kind of overdetermined kind of events are happening. And there's a discussion of predestination. So what's happening there is that there's kind of clash. And Diderot, in some of his other scientific works, thinks about almost a physiological freedom. The mind is not just a machine. It's not a clock. It's something that can do almost anything. It's like a keyboard that plays itself. And so some of this kind of neurophysiological kind of speculation he indulges in kind of sounds like there's a freedom on a physical level too. So I think it's a great question because it talks about, it shows us that he's kind of grappling with this in different contexts.
Thanks. So the last few years, I've thought a lot about the Enlightenment as it seems to be under threat in our society, and I think about Diderot especially of what he has to. 'Cause he seems to be very much a pioneer of deriving truth from looking at facts and interrogating them and so on, and we're now in this phase where that process seems to even be contested. What would he have to say about this? I mean, I assume there are parallels in the past, but
yeah. So this is one of those questions which brings Diderot into dialogue with contemporary society. And it's true, the Enlightenment is a time where he had a real belief in rationality, progress, education, and these universalist principles that we could all better ourselves through education. It's these kind of nice, lofty ideals. And the Enlightenment has some problems as well. It's the heyday of the slave trade at the same time. And so people look back at the Enlightenment and say, how could this supposedly great era also justify and actually rationalize a slave trade in thinking about, for example, racial classification schemes? And so the Enlightenment, the time of great classification, categorizing, the Encyclopedia, is also a time of great problems. So that's one of the things that's going on with the Enlightenment's being under attack right now. What would Diderot think of right now, based on the way that people are talking to each other? I think he'd be quite sad because, again, the people who are talking to each other are not skeptics, which is to say they're dogmatic. And philosophically speaking, these are two kind of opposed, these are polarities. Dogmatists will not deviate from their truth, and skeptics are willing to kind of look at everything, skeptics in a kind of philosophical sense. And so I think it'd be quite sad. And hopefully he'd be smart enough to kind of poison the other side and be kind of a Tai Chi master with some of these discourses because he was so smart and interesting. So I'm not sure exactly what he'd do, but he'd be disappointed, I think. He'd be sad.
A more practical question for those of us who haven't read a lot of Diderot. Are his works generally available in translation? And is there, you mentioned one or two that are sort of he's well known for, but is there like a great entry point into his writings if we want to read him directly after we read your book, obviously?
That's right. What I'd really love is starting with a book called The Philosophical Thoughts, which is very, very short. And the philosophical thoughts are these pithy aphorisms. They're almost like maxims, which really kind of give us a kind of an interesting take on his view of life. The basic philosophy. Again, the skepticism is the first step toward truth comes from that book. And these are really great kind of things you can kind of keep in your head your whole life. And then I think the best book, in addition to Jacques le Fataliste, which is kind of a fun, like Lawrence Stern type read, is Rameau's Nephew. It's almost good to act out. It's quite complicated, but it shows Diderot in discussion with somebody who's like him, lui, him and me. And in Rameau's Nephew, he kind of takes his most skeptical beliefs and puts them in the mouth of somebody, and they have this fabulous debate about the Enlightenment, about identity, about who we are as people, and that's really kind of a great thing. I think also D'Alembert's Dream would be interesting for this crowd, quite frankly, because he gets into, as I said, natural selection and this wonderful, fabulous kind of history of humankind, and again, dealing with identity in a material world. Another great book. All in translation. These are all available, multiple editions. Yeah.
Hi. Could you talk some more about the Encyclopedia? How many people were involved in the project? What was his contribution? When was it published?
Well, the Encyclopedia is the kind of the fat part of the book here. There's two big chapters on it. And it's interesting because it started off as this translation project in the 1740s. And Diderot was hired as a translator, and the main editors keep on getting fired. And eventually the editors say, okay, we might as well just hire this guy as the editor. The publishers hire him as the editor. And that's how it kind of starts, again, by chance. And he looks at this translation project from an English dictionary as this incredible opportunity. It's like you made him CEO of Google all of a sudden. He said, I can change the world with this. Now, this is somebody who'd been thrown in jail already, and so the publishers were a little nervous about it. And so he creates the encyclopedia like a labyrinth. He hides all sorts of different kind of heretical thinking inside the encyclopedia. It becomes really fun to read. We think about dictionaries as being objective and neutral, and he didn't think about that. He didn't think that was true at all. He thought this could be just an astonishingly fun and interesting and useful and a world-changing kind of book. He gets in a lot of trouble. The book gets in a lot of trouble. In 1752, it gets shut down. 1758, it gets shut down permanently by the king, and they have to take it underground. And the publishers actually buy a second publishing house all the way in Lyon and publish the remaining volumes there while it's forbidden. The Pope said that the book should be burned. And eventually, after the political climate shifted a little bit, they were able to bring them back together. They bring back 40,000 volumes of the encyclopedia and distribute it. 4,400 subscribers subscribed to this. It was a luxury edition. It wasn't for everybody. It cost a fortune to have a book like that. But there are a lot of pirated editions as well, and so it took off all over the country and all over Europe. The United States, people in the United States had it. Catherine the Great had it. It really disseminated Enlightenment ideology in a way that had never been done before. Scandalous ideas often circulated in small books. You can pass them from one person to the other. This was this gigantic book, a proud book with a king's imprimatur and stamp on it. And it was big business, too. It was kind of the Silicon Valley of the day. I mean, it was making so much money publishing, so the king was quite nervous about canceling it. Eventually, he just said, we just can't do it anymore, and canceled it. I could go on for 6 hours, but that's probably what I should do for now.
Thank you. Thank you.
It's a great story. The encyclopedia is a fascinating story.
So I'm kind of curious how he went from a small town of like 8,000 people to the court of Catherine the Great. What was the impetus for him showing up in that part of the world?
So why would this small town wannabe priest end up with Catherine the Great? It's a great question. So he became very famous, obviously, with the encyclopedia, and she had taken over through a coup in Russia, and Russia wanted to become part of Europe. And so she wanted to import some talent. She wanted to lure Voltaire there and D'Alembert there, the other co-editor of the encyclopedia, and Diderot. Diderot was the only one who really went there among the kind of the varsity team of the French Enlightenment. So he goes there for 3 months. And he went there because she had given him a lot of money. She was his great protector. And he also thought he could reform Russian society. He said he produced all sorts of political treaties for her. And eventually, when they all got to her, she was very unhappy about some of these things because she said, you know, you are a despot, and if you don't change your ways, Russia is going to end up in a revolution. Said the same thing about France as well. So, but it was really funny. There was a huge social class distinction, but you could see that these philosophers really functioned as rock stars at the time.
All right, thank you very much. Let's all give one more round of applause for Professor Curran.
Thank you so much.